Coming up, is an 11-7 record for Coach Jacque Vaughn worthy of being the stalwart, the cornerstone, the leader of the Brooklyn Nets going forward in this season and beyond? We'll break down all the stats next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there is Doug Norrie. Over here is Adam Armbrecht. And we thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. And Doug, as we start to dive into a conversation around one head coach, Jacque Vaughn, I want to touch base with you before I give a very important shout out to a Brooklyn Nets fan.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some Jacque Vaughn versus Steve Nash. I mean, I don't think that's a debate here, but we're going to talk about more about whether or not Jacque Vaughn has done enough in this short period of time to maintain as the head coach going forward. Like, I mean, I think clearly he's going to be the head coach for the rest of this season, but is there enough of a case to make it so that he's just the long-term solution? Because I think as Nets fans, we have to start thinking about, what the reality is around the coaching situation. I think Vaughn's somewhat polarizing. I think there's a pretty good case, at least in the short term, to be made that the Nets have made some significant improvements here and that he should stick around maybe for longer than some people think.
Yeah, and he has that signed the 2-year extension. But the funny thing about it is there's no guarantees when it comes to that because Jacque Vaughn has been shuffled around this organization for some time now. But before we dive in, I just wanted to, we always talk about on this show how we appreciate the fans and appreciate the support on YouTube and on the podcast feed. And we genuinely mean it. And this morning, coming off of yesterday's conversation around resting Kevin Durant, shout out to John Charles, who said, I started watching you guys to hate watch, honestly. But I must say, over time, I really started to like your approach to analysis and generally like hearing you guys talk ball. Keep up the good work. Doug, we're changing hearts and minds out here, and that's what I think is most important.
Always up for a good hate listen. I hate listen to plenty of stuff. Like
listen, it's totally cool, man. You can hate as hard as you need to as long as you keep listening.
I have an ongoing text thread with another friend that's just hate. I'm not going to say which podcast this is, but it's about basketball and football. It's only hating on it. Like it's just every single week we just text each other about how much we hate it, and we just head right back over and do it. So you want to love it, you want to listen because you love it, listen because you hate it. I don't really care. Just listen. It all ends up same as the download section.
That being the case, we like I said, always appreciate everyone supporting the podcast in whatever form you choose to. So on Jacque Vaughn, though, I mentioned there at the top that he was signed for this year, extended this year and next season as the head coach, which in theory would tell you, well, of course he's going to be the head coach, at least in the foreseeable future. And yet we know with how much is kind of on the line in this season for Sean Marks and for this organization and what could happen going forward, I think that's why it was an apt discussion that you wanted to bring up around, hey, like, are we seeing some trends here with this team that we can directly tie to Jacque Vaughn and him being deserving of steering the ship?
Okay, so I think from a high level, I think most people would agree that Jacque Vaughn has done better than Steve Nash. I think that really is not in debate. I don't think that I've never heard someone make the counterpoint, judging by how people felt about Nash, either before he was fired and after. I don't think we're at any risk of any Steve Nash stands coming back in here and making the case for Nash. So I think that one is solved. Just from a wins-loss perspective, it's been 18 games since Nash was fired. They lost that first one to Chicago, where it really looked like they were going to win. Durant went fully crazy in the first half, and then they ended up losing. Overall, they are 11-7 since Vaughn took over, including a West Coast trip. Now, there is some context in that with who they played for sure, but just on a win-loss level, which is what most people are going to start with, they have been a good winning team since he took over with the exact same personnel and without Kyrie Irving for a stretch of that, right? Because that was around when Kyrie had to leave the team. And so there was a situation that just, they were playing undermanned to start, and Simmons has obviously been in and out of the lineup as well. I mean, from that perspective, just I know we're going to go beyond wins losses because there are some other stats to sort of back up that there's been a noticeable shift in this team. But do you think that there's been, from Vaughn's standpoint, like, do you think there's been a maybe I'm leading this question too much, but do you think there's been a clear attitude shift in the team? Like, do you just from just a non-statistical thing, right? Like watching this game and a team on a game-to-game basis, we watch, every minute of this stuff and read every comment and read every post game and pre-game and every single thing that goes on with this thing. Do you think there's been like sort of just a cultural shift? I can't believe I'm doing it. I'm saying culture, a cultural shift in the way the team operates now, just simply based on the switching from Nash over to Vaughn in the head seat.
I think so. From a player standpoint, I don't necessarily think so. And I don't mean that as a negative around Jacque Vaughn. I just mean that, well, Kevin Durant is always played at a high level. He's had some of his best stretches of his career last season while underneath Steve Nash. Now, whether or not we think that Steve Nash was putting the team and the players in the best chance to win games, put that to the side. I think you've often said this, that players are going to go out and play. Like they're going to give it their all, whether it's for contracts, whether it's for stats, et cetera. That's always going to be the case. However, maybe, and I actually think that there are X's and O's that we'll see over the course of the season. We've already seen samples of it this year with Jacque Vaughn as the head coach, but I think that that'll grow as we move forward. The biggest shift has been, I think, perceptually from the outside looking in at the team when you hear Jacque Vaughn talk in pre- and post-game press conferences, right? And you've highlighted this. We've talked about it a couple of times. Like, he gets into a little bit of the X's and O's about it. He also gets into it from a accountability standpoint, where whatever was going on behind the scenes before he took over, he's saying it publicly. Your minutes are your minutes. Be ready to play. I'm setting rotations, expectations. I don't care. Either if you're not named Kevin Durant, you need to be ready when I call on you. So there is a sense of, I think, really taking control from Jacque Vaughn, where if something was going to go awry here with Kevin Durant, Kyrie, Irving, TJ Warren, anybody, I would feel a lot more confident in the way in which Jacque Vaughn would go about handling it than, ironically, the coach that was in place, who was supposed to be a player's guy. But I think that mostly became about like pacifying egos as opposed to challenging them. And some players, Kevin Durant has said this, they want to be challenged like that. And Jacque Vaughn is that personality.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Besides just the statistical stuff got there, on some of Vaughn's stuff, you are right in that just the overall tone here is totally different. If you listen to I don't listen to every coach's pregame pressers, so I'm not going to do a league-wide comparison about how these guys roll. But Vaughn gives as detailed an answer as you'll ever hear about very specific questions. Last game, he was asked about Kevin Durant double teams going into the Boston game and gave a really detailed, this is what they're going to do. These are the guys that need to perform. This is what needs to happen. He's talked about this when it comes to rebounding. He's talked about this in terms of rotations. Like, he gives very specific answers in a situation where most coaches don't want to tell you anything. They don't want to say a single thing. They want to just be done with the interview and they want to go back to coaching basketball. I think Vaughn, to some degree, whether he's doing it as part of his resume building or just part of his overall sort of gestalt, I think that, who cares? He gives very, very detailed answers around the situations, which point to a ton of thought having gone into this. Not to say other coaches don't put tons of thought into it. You have to. To be a good coach, there's so much. This is a massive chess piece, or chess board here. But Vaughn, from that standpoint, I agree with you that I think that he's shown enough, at least in this stint here, that you'll never worry if they haven't thought about it. Whether or not the answers are correct, right. That's time will tell. But I think with Nash, sometimes the worry was, hey, is there any process here, at all? Or is it just we're throwing stuff at the wall because we don't really know what we're doing? And that it had a helter-skelter type feel to it. Some of it was definitely not his fault, right? He just was dealt with crazy lineup construction stuff and crazy turnover. But Vaughn's had some of this too, and it hasn't felt the same way. Vaughn has had Simmons in and out of the lineup. Kyrie not there for long stretches. Injuries. This stuff has happened. Kevin Durant, having some quotes about the teammates. There's stuff that's happened here, and it just hasn't had the same feeling because I think he is just a steadier hand. And maybe just more cerebral, at least from an outward-facing standpoint, than Nash really ever was.
And I think coming up in a second here, we'll discuss what Jacque Vaughn can continue to do to build on what he's kind of set here early in his tenure taking over as the head coach. And also why sometimes just the contrast of the opposite thing of what you'd been seeing is also a recipe for feeling better about what a team can accomplish.
Yeah, we're going to get into that and got some stats as well to back it up. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks, where daily fantasy is made easy. You're making entries on Prize Picks. You're not worried about salary caps. You're not worried about just trying to fit all the different players in there. You're just going against their player projections, more or less. And that's really all it is to it. Like if you're into NBA, especially with the Nets, wait till tomorrow or today if you listen to it over at Prize Picks. You go to your favorite players, you pick more or less with points, more or less with rebounds, assists. You can combine those like to, points plus rebounds plus assists all together. They have all the combinations and all the stats you could ever want. Like I said, you're not going against those sharks in the water on some of those other daily fantasy sites. It's just you versus the Prize Picks projections. You pick 2 to 6 players. You figure out if they're going to score more or less than the projection. You can win up to, wait for it, 25 times your money on any entry, no competing against other people, and really every sport in there. NBA, like I said, NFL, obviously, NHL if you're rolling through hockey, and then I can't even read the list of all the Prize Picks offerings here because we'd be here for the rest of the podcast. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's super easy. They're currently operational in over 30 states and our friends to the north in Canada. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive 100% instant deposit match up to $100. You have to use the promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks is going to give you $100. Deposit $50, Prize Picks is going to give you $50. You can figure out all the other iterations. Don't forget to use the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy.
And friends, now that you've made the Locked On Nets podcast your first listen of the day, why don't you go ahead and make the second listen Locked On Sports Today? From the games that matter most to the biggest storylines in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes. With local experts and insights that only the Locked On Network can provide. Locked On Sports Today is available on the Audible app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled. Okay, so I kind of want to dive into some of these statistics here that you have that maybe support the idea that Jacque Vaughn is deserving of being here long term. But I'll just round out the thought that I had there at the end of the first segment, that when you have a really disappointing run around superstars and what you want to accomplish, sometimes the change is a success in and of itself. Just getting rid of Steve Nash, that makes everyone feel better. Jacque Vaughn, I'd be very interested if it had been a team that was treading at 500 over these last 18 games with him at the helm. How would that have felt differently for the roster, for the fan base? We won't know because they've won more of these games. And in that way, they have been lucky to play some teams that were either depleted or just not that talented or among the more talented teams. That certainly helped. But guess what? You want that launch pad no matter whether it was Jacque Vaughn or a new coach whenever they may come in.
Look, let me just real quick as a disclaimer, roll through a few of these games where they played, where the other team was just undermanned, right? Okay. I'm not going to go through all of them, but that's clearly a part of it because some of these stats are predicated on just who they played. So most recently, Boston was basically full strength except for Marcus Smart. Robert Williams hasn't played the whole season. Toronto was a mostly full strength team this version, but the time before that was just like a nobody squad. Washington, mostly full strength. Orlando, definitely not. Portland, definitely not. No Dame. Indiana, whatever. They lost to them and shouldn't have, but that team was mostly full strength. Philly, definitely not, and they lost. Memphis without Ja. Portland again where Dame went down, and so on and so forth. So there are some examples in here for sure where they played undermanned teams. There were some examples where they played full strength teams. That's just going to happen in the course of the NBA roster, NBA season. I think it's a little bit of a nitpick, but it's definitely there, right? Go ahead, and then I'll go through some of these stats.
And I will say again, because Steve Nash has a laundry list of reasons why he should have been let go. But when you go back and look at the start of the year and remember that they played the Pelicans, the Raptors, the Grizzlies, the Bucks, the Mavericks, and then the Pacers twice there. I mean, the Pacers aren't really necessarily, but we highlighted at the time playing teams that are deep playoff, high caliber teams that you're playing early in the season. It almost was why Steve Nash gets fired after 7 games. Maybe so you don't put Jacque Vaughn or the next coach in a position to just have to muddle their way through a part of the schedule. But let's hit those stats.
Okay, so since Vaughn took over, the Nets are actually performed statistically really well. Now, again, you only get to play who you get to play, right? Like that's just where they are. But in terms of offensive rating, they're 11th in the league. Excuse me, getting choked up about how good
Always
these stats
does.
are. At 112. So top third in the league. I think you'll take that. Maybe with a Kevin Durant led offense, you'd like that to be a little higher. Just because and especially with Kyrie too. But remember, Kyrie sat out a decent amount of these games. From a defensive standpoint, they rank 6th, 108.3, and their overall net rating is 3.9, which ranks them 7th. So this team, and over an 18-game sample size, which definitely has some cupcakes on the schedule, is still performing like a team like that you would want to see. That's where the stats want to be. They rank in the top 10 in terms of net rating because that's just who they've had to throw out there from an opposing standpoint. I think from that level, you have to, and then we're going to go into some of the rotational stuff that he's done differently. Yeah. I think just from a high level statistically, you have to be really, really encouraged about where they've stood during this 18-game run, which again, 18 games, not a massive sample size, but you're getting closer to just playing enough different teams here, right? Yeah. and that's just the way it is. Because we're not going to go through and dissect all the other teams that sit above and below them, because as the sample size grows, you're forced to just take the numbers as they are and say, hey, there's only 30 NBA teams. These are other NBA players. Yes, some of them are worse than others. We've seen some teams massively outperform expectation this season and some underperform it. And in the end, if you've had this many games and you're winning, you're scoring more points than you're allowing, which is what they've done. And that was not the case before this, right? Before he took over with basically the same personnel. Because that's the other thing where you get to control for Nash is that like the personnel was basically the same, right? Like if they didn't make a whole new team along with Jacque Vaughn, I guess Simmons turned a little bit of a corner, and you can say that. But for the most part, I just think from that level, it's super encouraging that these are the numbers after this stretch. I'll build in a little downside on the defensive stuff because yes, they've played some easier teams, but they look good defensively against Boston, who's a good offensive team, right? Like they have some stuff on the resume here.
Yeah, and I think because I was going to bring up, right, well, Ben Simmons didn't look anything like himself or the version that we've seen at the start of the season versus now, but he's also missed games. And Yuta Watanabe has been important, but he's also missed games. And Joe Harris is just starting to find his rhythm here too. So there's a number of different things that you can always go one side of the ledger or the other. I was trying to remember back to even last season when the Nets were having some success in statistical categories. This is kind of where I think, again, and this is actually in Jacque Vaughn's corner, is you have enough talent. Most teams in the NBA do. You're winning or losing in the margins. You're winning and losing by the way you're led by your head coach and by the small changes that he may make, including inside the rotations, which we'll get into here in a second.
Real quick, let me because I just filtered it out real quick, just for what they were, just as a comparison of where they were before they took over. So when the first 8 games where the Nets were 2-6, they ranked 28th in defensive efficiency. And I just had it. So it's 28th in defensive efficiency, and it was, I think, 24th. Let me just go scroll down here.
And again,
19th with
okay.
a negative 6.7 net rating. Yes, those teams were better. That's such a massive difference. Like it's such a huge difference that it actually does control for some of the opponents, right? Like because it's just such a huge shift in what they had done leading up to that point.
So we want to get into the rotations here in a second. The other thing that I'll say to support this, and we'll get confirmation here as we move forward, but at some point the numbers are just the numbers, as you said. And like I was looking at it right now, they're going to start with Charlotte coming up here, but all the way through the end of the month, when you look at the teams, they're going to get Charlotte bookends actually this stretch here to December 31st. They have the Pacers and the Wizards in there, the Raptors, the Pistons, the Golden State Warriors, the Bucks, the Cavs. Like there'll be some benchmark tests here. They have Atlanta twice inside of that as well. But at some point, you're just going to look at it and say, where are the ratings? Where are the numbers? I can't take care of who was available or who wasn't available. And once a sample size gets big enough, and maybe we already are at that point, I think we're already on that precipice of it. But once the sample size gets big enough, you are just what the numbers are. And maybe that's something that we can start to hang our hat on with Jacque Vaughn as the head coach of saying, okay, what do we think can happen over the back half of this season? If we believe that he's making smart decisions and he's making some little tweaks, and we're going to discuss rotations here and how he adjusted from what Nash was doing to what he's doing, well, then you can start to dream on how this team can grow over 40 and 50 games, which can be an exciting prospect for a team that has had a terrible start just in terms of off and on the court.
100%. All right, we're going to get into a little bit more of this as we close out the show. First, going to tell you about our friends over at betonline.net, your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. If you go over to betonline.net right now, you're going to see Kevin Durant. He is currently ranked 7th in MVP odds. Get it together, BetOnline. I know this is the number one source. Maybe this is just where people stand and we're homers. How is Anthony Davis plus 1,600 over Kevin Durant? I'm going to give it BetOnline. I'm going to have to give them a call. Just got to get that raised a little bit. Or maybe you want to go over there to grab a little value. That's what you're going to get over at betonline.net. The latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. Football, basketball, soccer, if you're still rolling through the World Cup. It's all there. If you love sports podcasts, they have it there as well. It's your fastest and easiest way to get a betting fix. Head on over to the website today to learn more. Bet Online, where the game starts.
So as we say, closing out the show, is Jacque Vaughn the coach of the future for the Brooklyn Nets? Listen, maybe we can make the case for some other coaches around the league that we'd love to drop in here and see what they would do. But I do think in the same way that the Nets gave Steve Nash more than a long leash at the helm of the Nets, you'd like to see this season and this sample size be something that says, you know what, maybe that's why we signed him to the 2-year extension. So that it wasn't this idea of, just play out the string here, which maybe would inspire Jacque Vaughn to do things a little bit differently, be a little bit more desperate in what he's trying to put out there for another potential coaching position. In a lot of ways, you can make the case that, hey, Jacque, you can put the pieces and the cornerstones in place of what you want to build on going into next year. And that does start with rotations and how you fill out the minutes on a game-to-game basis, something that he has done far better than Steve Nash ever did. There was a curiosity if there was a donkey on the wall with a Nets jersey that had everyone's name on it, and Steve Nash is just throwing darts blindfolded. At a minimum, Jacque Vaughn has said, I'm going to set the lineup. It's going to be these shares. It's going to change, but I'm going to be definitive and decisive about how I approach it.
Yeah, for sure. There's been less of a helter-skelter, like we said before, feel to what they've been doing. Certain players have been buried. There was one more stat I wanted to throw out there, and this was and then I'm going to get to the rotations. But it just had to do with when you play bad teams. The other case to say, like, okay, yeah, they play bad teams. Their opponent effective field goal percentage in the stretch since since Vaughn took over is number one. Like, they rank, the opponents have the lowest effective field goal percentage at 49.8. Next closest is the Bucks at 51.5. So you're like, oh, they play bad teams? Great. They dumpstered those teams in terms of what they've been able to do on defense. So, like, what more can you do? They played bad teams and they came out of that with the worst basically effective shooting of any team in the NBA during that stretch. So it's like you only get to play who you play, and they performed like they should have against those teams, like in the aggregate. Go ahead, and then we'll go through some of these things. Yeah,
get into the rotations here, but I'm just going to put a tease out for a future off day episode. I'm going to make a very strong case for a very bold move the Nets should make based on what is happening right now with Jacque Vaughn as the head coach.
Sign Boogie Cousins. I'm only saying that because I know that will just get everyone. I know that will get everyone into a tizzy because I get a Boogie Cousins mentioned once a day, pretty much on Twitter.
It's Boogie.
Okay, so a couple things that Vaughn has done, which I think are pretty, which I think you like to see, and you don't like to see this from the actual player and personal standpoint, but just from a basketball standpoint. One is he made what's that?
Buried Patty Mills.
That was the first one, right? Is that he's basically said Patty Mills is not part of this rotation for any meaningful minutes anymore. It was very obvious that this had to happen. He was just a liability basically on both ends, but specifically defensively. When you're already playing with something of a small team, it's going to be really hard for a guy like Mills to get away from it. That can be hard because he's a veteran. You sign him for 2 years here. And he's definitely like a guy that people in Brooklyn love. And so it can be hard in situations like this to basically put a guy like this at the end of the bench in favor of just better basketball. And so that did not look like something Nash was willing to do all the time. Maybe that's an organizational kind of shift, but making that move and saying, this is just not how we're going to play, I do think is actually a harder move than people claim it to be, right? Because of who Patty Mills, it's more about who Patty Mills is and who he's been than it is with like how obvious the move is to make. Like, it's hard to take a guy you just signed for 2 years, probably made some promises to. You definitely made like a money promise to them. He's a veteran. He was awesome for you last year. Like, he was a big reason that they were able to sort of maintain for longer stretches when the team was looking rough around the edges, and to basically say, you're not part of what we're doing here. Like, that's not easy. And they basically done that. So I don't want to use that as just like the only move here, because they have done some other stuff, like bringing in using Sumner probably a little bit more frequently than I thought they would have. Obviously going more with Yuta when they had to, and it was obvious when he's making every three. But there are situations here. But I just wanted to start with the Mills thing, because I don't want to just, while from a fan perspective, I think we could look at that and be like, yeah, duh, it's so obvious. Mills is just getting it's a total traffic cone on defense, and doesn't do nearly enough on offense to make it worthwhile with playing him. When you take Patty Mills as a player and a person too, like, it is a harder move to just stick someone like that at the end of the bench, especially when you are dealing with injuries and there's fewer guys, because that's the other thing that's happened, and he's still not getting playing time. So I do think that move signals something a little bit more like sort of cerebral about their process.
Yeah, as a veteran player too, right? I mean, listen, rocking the boat, so to speak, it does seem like Jacque Vaughn has had the ability to make these decisions without any concern. I mean, Sean Marks literally just signed him this offseason to the extension. So there has to be an understanding. I'm going to craft this roster the way I think it makes the most sense. Or even if there wasn't an understanding, Jacque Vaughn gets it. Hey, I'm going to put the best roster out there on the court and the best rotations, because if not, guess who gets? I get fired. The players don't get fired. And Doug has said this 1,000 times on the podcast. The players don't get fired. The coach gets fired. That's what changes first when things aren't working out. And so you are maybe potentially, it's funny when you look in these rotations too, just at a high level, you bring in Markieff Morris this offseason. You bring back Patty Mills. You bring in Yuta Watanabe. Edmund Sumner's on the younger side. There has been a little bit of this blend too, I think, in terms of I'm not beholden to a veteran player or a veteran name. With all the ways that it was talked about, you would have thought Markieff Morris had a very specific role for this team coming in the door. And yet, he has been buried on this roster. You mentioned about injuries specifically too. As injuries have come up, Jacque Vaughn has not dug deeper down into the rotation. He's actually looked at the top end of it and said, you guys have to do more. Why? Because you are the way we're going to win. Like, I'm not going to get that much further down. Now, we can debate about the Kevin Durant getting him rest scenario and why you might want to see him do that. Jacque Vaughn has not been perfect, or it's not to say there isn't areas that we can't debate or critique about him, but by and large, I'll go back to it. He's been decisive. Patty Mills, I see the results on the court. I watched the film. You can't play for us. Likewise, Cam Thomas, guess what? Fans are hyped about you, think you can be a spark plug. I gave you samples. It doesn't look good enough. You're a garbage time player right now. Like, you need to be able to make those decisions and not feel like there's going to be a backlash around it. And if we want to tie it to Kevin Durant,
real quick, before you tie it to KD, I want to put in one more guy like around the same idea, but on the other end. The other thing here is that it wasn't all results based either, because easily you could have found a way to bench Joe Harris here. Like, you could have said, like, you could have found a million reasons to bench Joe Harris. It was looking so bad, right? So bad. He went the opposite way, stuck with him, started him, and played him more minutes. And then what's happened over the last couple of games? He's shot like 65% from three. He's been one of their better players. He's been good two-way. It's like he came around. So it wasn't all just like this results-based sort of orientation. It was like, I had bad results from this other guy, but looking at that situation and saying, no, this is a situation we need to stick with here. And they stuck with it, and it's really, really paid off. So I just wanted to counterpoint that with it's not all just based on one guy playing bad and you get benched and like sticking with it. It's like recognizing the difference of playing bad maybe versus running bad, right? Like, because I think the Patty Mills thing was like playing bad. I think there was a case to be made that Joe Harris was running bad in terms of like hitting the three and stuff like that. I forget, the defensive stuff has looked, better of late, but that one maybe was less about running bad and maybe just more about getting his legs back. But they easily could have found reasons to just go away from him, and they didn't. Played him more, and it's super paid off over the last couple of games. So anyway, I just wanted to counterpoint those two moves.
No, it's really smart too, because publicly was supporting Joe Harris, like, putting the organization and the coaching staff and the players, everyone behind Joe Harris. And to your point, in that contrast, Patty Mills, the track record goes back to last season as well in terms of where the deficiencies are. With Joe Harris, likewise, the track record goes back to where he has been a very good, one of the best three-point shooters and a critical piece to this team having success. So yeah, having conviction on either end of the spectrum is something that Jacque Vaughn has shown here as well. I'll just close out on this thought around the idea that I was saying Kevin Durant, going back to the offseason and during this year, the conversations he had, the interviews he gave, where he was saying, I went and said, coach me harder, grind me, more practice. We need to be running fundamentals. We need to be running set plays. We need to be working on this stuff. I want to be coached hard. That is a top-down mentality that you can apply to every single decision and every single player that you make. And if you're Jacque Vaughn and you get named the head coach after Steve Nash is fired, whether or not it was directly had a one-to-one conversation with Kevin Durant or not, or if he just understood, hey, I've seen the way KD talks about it. That's a part of my mentality as well. I'm going to bring it. And I have a level of confidence that my best player is actually going to be all in on that process and on that approach, as opposed to having some real maybe divergent ideas with Steve Nash and the way that he was running things, practice, on-court rotations, and otherwise.
Yeah, and it helps that Katie gave the seal of approval in that Haynes interview, right? Like that is that's a big help, and that's a big check in the right direction for sure. And I think that and I don't think it's not by accident either. Like we said at the beginning, we've heard the way Vaughn talks about this. We've heard about just how he has conviction, how he's been open, how he's been talked about sort of the process and just like sort of maybe the science of coaching, which again is way more than you hear from other guys. And usually if you hear about it that way, it's because there's someone that's super confident in their process. Like you don't hear it as now. You can not hearing it doesn't mean you're not confident in your process for sure. Like I think that sometimes guys just don't want to talk. Like Pop doesn't want to talk to anybody, right? It's fine. And we'd all agree his process is good. Yep. So not saying it doesn't necessarily get points against you, but saying it and having conviction in the way you talk about it definitely does get you points. And I think that that's what we've seen with Vaughn, where he's clearly very confident in whatever he's bringing to the table here. And when you can talk about it and, willing to live with the things that don't go right, that's a big part of just being a coach. And I think we've seen enough from him there. So I think, from a long-term perspective, it's clear. I think that we've seen enough from him to at least, he's got the 2-year extension, but that doesn't always mean anything in the NBA, especially for especially for the money he makes too. Like it wouldn't be. It's just like this isn't a lifetime appointment for sure. But I think at least for now, we've seen plenty to know that this is someone we can sort of ride or die with, at least for this season. All right, we are going to get out of here. We will be live following the game on Wednesday evening, so make sure you go check that out over on YouTube. Hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube as we roll toward 4,000 followers. You'll throw questions up there. We try to bring some questions up, and we do extra bonus stuff on YouTube. So if you're only listening on the podcast feed, just know that post game on YouTube is you get bonus stuff. Like we usually go for 20 minutes, half hour more at least on those episodes. So like and subscribe over on YouTube.
And a lot of things are changing for the Brooklyn Nets, as we obviously know, and hopefully for the better. It makes me remember, what's weird? Day by day, nothing seems to change, but pretty soon, everything's different. Bill Watterson.
Oh, wait a second. That's Calvin and Hobbes? Is that who that is?
That is correct, sir.
There we go, baby. One of the all-time, I'm excited, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.